Thank you very much for coming this evening. It's a beautiful evening here in Perth. We are here to look at, and I'll give you the title, Imagining a New Policy Agenda for Australian Arts and Culture. More about that in a moment. My name is Shelagh. I'm the Director of the UWA Public Policy Institute. I'm also a Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at the university. I'm very pleased that many people have accepted the invitation to join us this evening, particularly coming from arts organisations, cultural institutions, government, business and non-profit. So you're very welcome in joining us this evening. This is a discussion aided by our panel and their insights, but also your observations about Australia and its culture and its arts, both as a sector, but also as part of our identity. This is not something necessarily just up our flagpole. Of course, as you're aware, it's very timely at the point at which there's a national discussion taking place about a national cultural policy in 2023, led by new Federal Minister, Tony Burke, and submissions for which just closed last month. And please keep an eye upon that in the context of our discussion. UWA Public Policy Institute does many things. One of the things we have produced earlier on this year is this publication, which I think you've been given a copy of as you came through. It sheds light on the kind of work we're doing. And if I can just say a little bit about the Institute, you may be aware of the fact that research-intensive universities all over the world have come under criticism in the last 5 or 10 years. The criticism is along the lines that they tend to keep themselves to themselves, they tend to be introspective, and they're interested in research outcomes as an end in themselves. I think that's largely true, and for that reason, the university that I'm a member of took the decision a few years ago to establish this institute in conjunction with others, if I may say so, the newly formed Defence and Security Institute, the Data Institute, just to name 2 examples, in order to make sure that our research is translated in a timely way. It's placed not just in the hands of decision makers in government, business and non-profit, but also it enters the public realm, and we are there, as it were, to foster public discussion. This report is jam-packed with, if I recall rightly, 40 or 42 short 800-word pieces looking at what the state's prospects might be in the middle part of this century. It covers prosperity, that speaks for itself. It also covers issues to do with place and environment, and fundamentally it deals with people, who we are, where we are, who we might become, and that is, as it were, an evolving story. So I commend that report to you, and I also point out that one of the panelists that are joining us this evening has made an important contribution, Jeremy, to that report. And the last thing, by way of introducing just the Institute, is to point out that this is not something just that affects UWA itself. It is, as I said, something that is about research-intensive universities all over. Just 2 days ago, Peter Shergold, who you may be aware of, in fact, was the former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in our federal government until quite recently, he's, when speaking at a very similar event, said, and if I can just quote, the point about university research is it's highly relevant to the economic and social and cultural decisions the governments make, and yet has limited impact on the decision makers that are involved in government. In other words, he's deeply regretting the irony of that, and we are part and parcel of the effort to push back and, as it were, to put right what's for so long has been a problem in the way in which universities communicate. Well, the policy agenda we can talk about, but just a few nuggets just to get ourselves going, some facts to do with arts and culture. People often make the point that, you know, it's probably quite a small sector, and that probably is exacerbated by the fact that we are in a resource and minerals state. For what it's worth, recent research produced by our colleagues at Curtin University estimated that it probably is a sector that here accounts for at most about $7.3 billion. Put that in context, in a $362 billion economy, that puts this sector at about 2% of the whole. So that's probably an unfair comparison because, of course, it's dwarfed by the importance of energy, minerals and resources, but it's important nonetheless to get a sense of the fact that that's the scale. In terms of jobs, that same study revealed that in the decade between 2006 and 2016, the growth in jobs in Australia in the creative industries was nothing less than just short of 28%, in comparison with the overall jobs growth in this country in that decade of 17%, so a good 10, 11% larger. Here in Perth, we're 1.6 times more likely to have workers in the creative industries as compared with Australia as a whole. We're looking at actually participating and being patrons of these industries. Something like 4 in 5 West Australians reported that they attended a cultural event or venue in the last year, according to the Curtin study. And the value to West Australians and their willingness to pay appears to have increased in the course of the last decade. And then lastly, on the subject of money, bound to come up at some stage or the other, here in WA, we live in a comparative warm spot, whereby at least government funding for arts and culture has been higher than the national average, but on a per capita basis. Remember, we live in a state with very, very few people as compared with other states. Meanwhile, the per capita expenditure on arts and culture across the country as a whole has been declining in the course of the last 15 years. So there's some kind of good news and bad news. That's just by way of just getting us to focus on the raw numbers. But really, to shed light on all this, we need people who are close to the creative sector and the creative industries. And for that reason, we've been able to, and I'm delighted to recruit 4 individuals as follows. First of all, we have Oron, who's an artist and director, and he's part and parcel of the Centre for Excellence in Biological Arts that's based here at UWA. More about him in terms of introduction in a moment. Secondly, we're very lucky to have Shelagh Magadza. She's the Executive Director for Culture and Arts in the Department of Local Government in the Western Australian Government. We previously knew her at the Institute as part of the Chamber of Arts and Commerce. Thirdly, on the home team at UWA, we have Dr. Noske, who's part of the School of Humanities at UWA, but also edits the Westerly magazine. And last but not least, already mentioned as part of the report, we have Jeremy Smith, sat closest to me here, who's a senior producer, and he's part and parcel of Performing Lives here in WA. So in order to have this discussion, less about me, I'm just here to sort of prop up the first part of the discussion. And let me just point out that you're in the very capable hands of Dr. Chris Lynn. Chris himself holds a relatively recent PhD in English and Cultural Studies from UWA, but more importantly, he's part and parcel of the staff of the Public Policy Institute. Chris is sat farthest away from me, and I'll now hand it over to him as part of his duties as being the chair hot seat this evening. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shelagh. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I just wanted to start by just welcoming everyone to our conversation this afternoon. A chance to is listening, which I'm at the Policy Institute. It's our absolute pleasure to bring conversation practice to at large. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our online audience as well, who are joining us online and will be engaging with us during the Q&A session a little bit later. Just to take you through some housekeeping, there is, but an emergency or any evacuations, we will get instructions over the internet, and just to know the exits that way, actually also, just the way that we're going to run the session, I think the conversation is moving forward as possible. We keen to allow panelists to rip off each other, to debate, to share ideas, and have a little bit of fun with this as well. But we will also have the opportunity to throw the conversation over to you as the audience for the last half an hour. So if there are any burning questions that you have, please keep them on board and you'll get a chance to ask them to our burning audience. So without further ado, we do have a stellar cast tonight. And we're really pleased that amongst our panel, we've got a mix of artists, art producers, public advocates and policy advocates, as well as researchers. We really have a good spread of, I suppose, artists / art workers who are right at the corners of what it means to, I suppose, be both work for, but also be affected by the creative industries and environment. I'd like to just further sharpen points a little bit by introducing our telecast. So I'll go all the way from my left, your right. Firstly, there's Jeremy Smith. Jeremy is a senior producer for the Performing Lives WA, where he works closely with WA's development arts. He's held former roles with the Australian Council for the Arts, and as well as the General Manager of HIP. Jeremy's working life has seen crossover arts funding, policy, sponsorship, and regional development across government, non-profits, and corporate sectors. And just to give a shout out to Performing Minds, they produce provocative and rebellious contemporary performance. And you know, we work in supporting artists with all aspects of the creation. Next to Westerly, we have Oron Katz, and Oron is the co-founder and director of SymbioticA, which is the Center of Excellence in Biological Arts. In 1996, Oron co-founded the Tissue Culture and Art Project with Noske Service Project. And as part of this project, they were the first to grow in 2000 and to eat in 2003, function meat. And in 2004, they distributed the year lab-grown leather.
Is this an intervention, Oron?
Nothing's wrong there.
My work here is done.
Anything else? But Oron also holds research positions at the Royal College of Arts UK, Stanford University, and the Tissue Engineering and Fabrication Laboratory at Harvard Medical School, amongst other positions. He's curated exhibitions for world-leading galleries all across the world. So very welcome to Oron. Next to Oron, we have Shelagh Magadza. Shelagh is the Executive Director of Culture and the Arts, Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries. Shelagh was also former Executive Director of the Chamber of Arts and Culture WA, the state's industry body. Sheila had an extensive career as an artistic director of major festivals, including Australia's largest multi-arts festivals in Perth and New Zealand. And directly opposite me, we have Kate. Kate is a from the WA School of Humanities. She educates theatre, writing, and literature. Kate is an author as well. She's been twice awarded the Elaine Mitchell Prize for Rural Writers. She was shortlisted for the 2015 Dorothy Field Award, and her novel, The Salt Madonna, was published by Ingrid Moore in 2020 and shortlisted for the WA 30 Years Book Awards. Kate serves on numerous boards, including Writing WA and Amazing Story, and she is the editor of Westerly magazine, which is the premier literary magazine on our West Coast. And I get to give a very warm welcome to our As John mentioned in his introduction, it's quite a timely moment for us to be up debating the art with the new national cultural policy that is in train at the moment. The submissions for that closed in August, and I believe over 1,200 submissions have been digested. And on the other hand, we've also just hopefully coming out of the ravages of COVID as well. And hopefully just starting to see both artists and festivals and events starting to pick up again, and us as participants and audience members looking to just re-engage with that space, especially if it's up to events in some sector as well. So that's really where I want to start. I think it's a moment of hope and it's also maybe a moment of innovation as well. The question I'd like to start for our audience with is, with the national cultural policy in mind, what do you believe are the most pressing challenges facing the arts in Australia today? And what is the one thing that you would like to see addressed in the new policy?
I'll step in there. Well, as you say, it's a fantastic time. And whilst you've raised this question, what are the challenges? I'm going to do that type thing and say they're all opportunities as well. I think, the first thing that Australia is facing and has faced for some time is the issue of resolving at a very fundamental level its relationship with our Aboriginal people, the First Nations cultures of this country, and how that frames our national conversation, our identity, and the values that we ascribe to the culture that we are creating collectively. I always think about arts and culture, we run it together, but culture in itself is something to be thought about separately, I think, to arts and artistic expression. And so that overriding defining culture of our identity and the conversations that we want to have are fundamentally important. And I guess the other challenges kind of flow from that, which is the impact of this rapid social change. COVID has just accelerated a whole lot of trends that we've seen. And a lot of that is the expectation of our citizenship for the quality of their life and how they wish to access arts and culture within their own lives, but also the kind of global impacts of that. That is very closely related to technology, isn't it? So we've kind of been at a printing press moment, I guess, for the last 20 years, which is the fundamental impact of technology and people's access to different knowledges, different cultures and different connections, but also different ways of creating. Some quite astonishing stuff that now sits way outside of the current models that we have for describing and grappling with our arts and culture sector. I think the other thing that's quite evident through a lot of the research is the unevenness of access across Australia, from early childhood through to very late in life. And unfortunately, it's very stark in that research that shows that people who have lower opportunity to access arts and culture attribute less value when they're surveyed on that question. So it's really important to look at who those communities are. And with a big dispersed regional population, that's quite a big challenge, as well as the unevenness of socioeconomic factors that affect that. But also, I think in that unevenness of access that we're possibly not looking at other areas where we could be placing arts and cultural experiences for people to include in their lives. And the last thing, I guess, is this really big issue, I think, that are related to all the things that I just mentioned, is the investment in our artists and our arts workers to address these challenges at a very profound level, not just a superficial level. And as any of you who are practicing artists know, you become a better writer or a better director by doing lots of directing and lots of writing. It's something that you have to do over and over again to become the best at. And we're not really creating those pathways in the creative side of things. And now we are facing also on the other side of the balance sheet, a looming skills crisis in all of our technical production support services for various reasons, that workforce is shrinking, departing, in crisis. And so our actual ability to achieve some of these projects is at risk.
So actually, I think quite a few of these there that will also have to do with submissions. We'll have to give ideas to the conversation.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Because my answer sort of picks up on quite a few of those things as well, in the sense that that first point you started with, the value of art. We're pretty familiar with arguing for the value of art in social and cultural terms, and sort of what it achieves as a cultural work, as a sort of vital social narratives that offers us the space for contesting ideas, and in the same way the space for representation of diversity. I think the challenge I see in that, and coming away from that, notes that importance in the sense of needing to recognise as well the generosity of that practice from First Nations activists, and ensuring that the policy we develop is both respectful of that space and engaging with it in positive ways. And in the same way, ensuring that this work on the level of nation, really, it's not exclusively deferred to the arts. And I think this connects to what you're saying about unevenness of access as well. The sense that the arts in conversations can at times be siloed off as this sort of social and cultural domain. So the intervention I'd be really interested in seeing is ensuring that there are some whole of government solutions to arts policy and to this question of what the arts achieves, the value of the arts, which ensure that what we know as the value of the arts and the impact of what the arts offers is enacted in sure generative and productive ways with connections through to education and broad areas of policy. And partly that's coming out of an anxiety that we didn't see a lot of discussion of the arts as a vehicle for achieving real world change in the last election. There was talk about the process and inequities of social opportunity, but not a lot of talk about how the arts can contribute to addressing some of those things. And the unevenness of access that you know, I think, is part of that question.
If I
Are we broken now? Yeah, I think we dropped it so many times.
Already
Yeah.
dropped this 4 times.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I already did my mic. Thank you. Yeah, just briefing on your point. So Australia is in a really interesting place. In the sense that we have the oldest knowledge in the world that is in risk of disappearing. And we are one of the earliest adopters of new technologies, as you mentioned. And I think what we're facing and where art can actually contribute a lot, and that's rarely being discussed, it's not just the digital technologies that we need to engage with. There's so much technologies that are accelerating to such an extent that we as a culture and a society can't come to terms with. And the role of art is making sense of it and bring meaning to those changes and try to point the finger at places that we have no language to describe is really important. And if we don't pick up on it, we'll be, it's not that we'll be left behind, things will kind of just wash over us in such a way that we would wish that we would have the artists to actually kind of show us where we might go and what we can do.
Yeah, look, I think one thing that I was going to offer on this response, which sort of, I guess, encapsulates a lot of the comments that have been said so far, is that we just can't go back. I think there's an opportunity to reset, and I think there's been so much that has been wrong in our past, be it to our host people, be it to climate action, be it to inclusion, be it to workforce diversity, and be it to, I guess, the haves and the have-nots and cutting up of the pie. I think this is a really important and timely moment to reset. I think as a sector, we need to be a lot more comfortable with embracing disruption and, I guess discomfort, because I think there will be really crunchy moments coming up when we have to change the way that we do things and the way that we relate and act and make and create and play and do all those sorts of things. And I think, there's been a big rise in more recent times, I think, as a result of the pandemic, of activism and, listening and harnessing that energy and how we can sort of build that into a better, more sustainable future for artists, organisations and audiences as a whole. I mean, picking up on something that Sheila said, and I think even looking at here tonight, one big thing that's happening at the moment is, I think everyone, be that artists, be that organisations, be that venues, be that our nation, and be that punters, are so inward focused and inward gazing that we're just starting to see that outward gaze return. Which is where, people are looking to explore and reignite new partnerships, and, attendance has been low. I mean, I think when there's free events, people are just not showing. And that's been a really significant big thing. We found that recently through our Collion program. So I guess it's going to take time for people to, I don't know if it's a confidence issue or whatever, but it's a really big shift that we've noticed through a lot of our free programs, that there's just been a really big no-show rate, really, which I think for our sector that relies on participation, relies on attendance, is really quite significant. So,
can I just add to that as well, that a large part of arts and culture is at a community level, and that's driven by volunteering.
Yeah.
So it's not even about paid jobs, and a lot of those volunteers are people who were affected by COVID.
Yeah.
So there's a real danger of loss of some of those opportunities as well.
Thanks very much. It shows us that there's plenty to play for, both with the new cultural policy and but also just more broadly as well. I'm only got two of those key words that came out of the responses there. Provided one was around value, and the second was around access. So on those two. So I believe my next question, which is to say that the value of art is often framed in terms of economic benchmarks. When it adds to the economy, therefore how much money it's worth. I don't want to underestimate that or necessarily give it. But I believe the economic value of the art notwithstanding, what about how might we bring in other ways of framing the value of the arts? What's the maybe a way that moves to the idea of arts as a public good? So that's to say to exist independently of their own right or of their own purpose and for everyone.
One thing that came up during Collion, which at Collion, for those that haven't been working, is it's been a 3-year initiative which Performing Lines instigated by listening to independent artists at the heart of the pandemic in 2020 to make space, time and freedom for artists to connect and play and you know, I guess reconnect with the sector and organisations and venues and life beyond lockdown. And one of the things that I think when we ran a session at this year's event about the National Cultural Policy consultation process was there's a real alignment for, I think, we recognise as workers with the portfolio that Minister Burke has, which I don't think is anything that's really sort of truly been nailed before. So I think that's really goes to these things too, I guess, around you know, the economic prospects of the arts, but then also identifying and recognising those people that make up that workforce are workers and not just hobbyists or, you know, doing things for, you know, for whatever sake, I guess. So yeah, and I think the other part of that too, which is something that I sort of learned a lot about in my former lives, both as a creative producer, but then also in the portfolios that I have at the Australian Council, was the importance and recognition of cultural practice, be that by First Nations people, be that, you know, in Sydney I was working with a lot of diaspora from SymbioticA and other communities that just get together and make their cultural practice together, you know, and that's really something that falls through the cracks in terms of recognition of the impact of what our sector delivers initiatives as well.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. On this, Sheila, would you like to jump in on sort of football?
Yeah, I can talk about this. Yeah, so maybe I'll use an example. Just you know, it's obviously that this idea of trying to monetize everything that happens around us is an issue, and by getting involved in this conversation, you already lost the debates. If you are dealing with something that cannot be easily monetized, so you think about kind of in the conservation movement, when they start to talk about kind of ecosystem services that you can monetize, you actually lost a bit of conservation because you put a value, dollar value to natural assets, and by that, if you can make more money out of them in another way, that can happen. You already opened up this conversation, and I think it's the same in culture. You know, so human culture always existed before money and before we monetize things. And there's no way we can start to think about it in those terms without losing the essence of what culture is, which is much bigger than just being able to quantify it in such a way. And so, and there's a really interesting aspect that art, one of the roles that art plays is to shine a mirror back at society. You have to keep your distance in order to be able to have the reflection. If you play the game, you're already part of the reflection, you're not the mirror.
I think too, what you mentioned there, Oron, in terms of that discrepancy between the use of the economic and the use of art in its own right, points a little bit to something of the tendency we have to suggest economic value versus public good in the dichotomy. I don't think it's that simple. There's a sense when realistically they're much more mutually inclusive than exclusive, and that those systems are the ways in which we've shifted to see art and economic terms have developed in such, you know, with such complex histories, as you know, that it's untangling them now is impossible. I think we see that a little bit in the sense that the immediate public good that appealed to me, alongside that sense of art marriage, I think it's a beautiful point, is the possibilities for community building that exist around the arts. And that exists both sort of inclusively to the sector, so community building internally, and community building externally to the centre, which sits across those frames of bringing in people and getting bums on seats and that sort of structure that's more usually seen on an economic scale. And in the same way, that, you know, the former, the community building internally to the sector depends on economic development, the latter, community building externally, expanding the scope of the arts and increasing contact with it depends on audience cultivation, which requires investments. All these things are really quite deeply entangled. It's so that I don't know that those dichotomies between public good and economic structure are that simple or that useful, really, when we're thinking about this dilemma of how we articulate how the arts work.
Some of the issue is about the lack of language and tools to describe and measure arts and culture, and people think about it as intangible. And I'm looking at Tabitha here because she's very familiar with the work of John Smithies over at the Cultural Development Network, who tried to make that more tangible by creating 5 cultural measures so that there were cultural outcomes that were important in their own right. Because we do have, I mean, other tangential things that we measure, like mental health and well-being is obviously an area of great impact on education, etc. But he had these 5 measures that are creativity has been stimulated. Well, these are outcomes, sorry, that you can measure. Aesthetic enrichment has been experienced. Knowledge, ideas, or insight has been gained. Diversity of cultural expression has been appreciated, and a sense of belonging to a cultural heritage has been deepened. And he argues that if you build those in as your expected outcomes from the investment or the work that you're doing, you can measure that from as outcomes and report against it. And this was picked up in a conversation that we were having yesterday with someone who deals a lot across local government and kind of how to embed the appreciation or the importance of cultural planning within local government. And he said, well, of course, the key thing is that local governments are not required to report against any of their cultural activity. They have to report against their rubbish and their climate action, but there is nothing reportable for them to put forward. So of course it slips down their priorities. So if you could somehow give people tools and measures against which they can report, then possibly you could demonstrate that value.
The dirty quotas word.
The dirty quotas word, yeah.
Thanks everyone for your input. Just a quick can I get the panelists just get closer to the mic, so that's okay. We're just getting to report to the audience, online audience, so we can hear. All really compelling ideas. I want to move the conversation a little bit to something that came out of Sheilah's response and something that Jeremy mentioned as well, which is the importance of play. Sheilagh, you mentioned, obviously, if you want to be a director, be a writer, or any form of artist, you need to do those things, and you need to be in an environment where experimentation, risk-taking, and failure are encouraged and sort of leveraged in that way. So, I want to quote something from Jeremy. You previously said that you'd love to see a policy environment for our arts and cultural sectors that backs bravery, encourages boldness, and really shakes up the concepts and scales we consider when making, creating, and playing. Could you elaborate on these ideas a little bit, especially on the importance of playing and experimentation?
Yeah, I think so much of what we do in the sector is informed by caps and informed by criteria and informed by other forms of guidelines, I guess. And so quite often they're quite condensed and squashed. And so I think as a sector, we sometimes don't know how to think big and how to, be bold and ambitious and play and do all those sorts of things, I think, because we always sort of go for the smaller pieces of the pie. It's funny, like when I was at the Australian Council, the first time I went through my portfolio was the longest upright stationery. I had sort of, my title was the Arts Practice Director for Community Arts and Cultural Development and Emerging Experimental Arts. I used to call it the socks and jaw straw because it was all sort of parts of the sector that no one else really wanted to follow in the field with. And so I remember the first time we went through an annual reporting process, I saw the pie kind of that grants program and the organisation funded, and there was this one little sliver of the pie called cross arts. And I sort of said, what's that? And they just said, that's your portfolio. And I sort of said, is that because I'm fucking angry we get so little? I mean, that's really and I think that's because a lot of work in that space around community practice, around experimental practice, is really rich and really cutting edge and really exciting around the sorts of things like Oron is a rock star overseas. We're going to say that now. I mean, the work that SymbioticA has done and many others that have been pioneers in Western Australia and in Australia in the space that have been bold and dreamt big and just gone out and really broken and shaken up what we consider to be the norm in arts practice here. And I think that pursuing those opportunities through collaborations and through bringing together other forms of support is rather than sort of a piecemeal approach that is prescribed by individual funding programs. But then having said that, I know there have been programs, for instance, in Victoria, which have encouraged boldness and bravery that have failed because artists weren't ready for it. And they haven't been able to sort of put together the sort of applications and then deliver them because that was really significant, substantial sums of money. So I guess it's that fine balance, being able to, you know, an experimental arts risk and failure is so important.
Yes,
So,
did they really fail? Did the Victorian program really fail,
Yeah.
or you learned a lot from it? In a sense,
well, exactly, that's right, yeah.
So,
I mean, the other thing, which I think we don't have nearly enough on scholarships.
Also, the original idea of play and experimentation on. Actually, we were to your audience, okay? You can maybe talk to the audience a little bit about the work you do as an artist, and also the work you do with Symbiotic, which is a really fascinating example of what art can do in cross-disciplinary environments.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. So I suppose in general, my interest was life and how our relationship to life is changing and shifting, and how new knowledge about life, and you know, you can insert anything else to do with new knowledge that we gain as humanity is kind of progressing with the quest to understand the world around us. But in my case, it's life, and life is a very fundamental question that I think is very connected to the arts. And so I decided to park myself in a biological science department in a research university or in a research setting in order to see how life is now being transformed into a raw material to be engineered and the issues that are stemming from there. But one really interesting thing that comes out of that is the fact that by life becoming kind of this subject for human manipulation, it also opens up an extremely problematic new palette for artistic exploration. And this is what we've done at SymbioticA. We basically invited artists to come and spend time into that, to understand what's going on with life in the context of scientific and engineering research, and be playful about it and see where it might take us in order to raise questions.
Can you unpack that concept of life a little bit more? Let's start with the materiality of, so when you say you work with life.
So the main interest of United myself when we started working with the Tissue Culture and Art project back in 1996 actually came from a particular image that hit the media in 1995, and that was of the mouse that had a human ear growing through its back. I don't know if you remember seeing it. It was an amazing image because human culture, almost all human cultures, I think all of them, have images of this human-animal hybrids. It exists in our psyche. And suddenly in 1995, you see a naked mouse, or a mouse with no hair, with a human ear growing from its back. Basically, it's the surrealists the dreams come alive. It's everything that you can imagine that our kind of nightmares and our dreams were made of. And it's on the TV screen, made by scientists in Harvard University or in Boston. And I said, you know, scientists did it. I think it's the work of artists to figure it out. Because what they've done was to sculpt with living biological material. And again, it's for better or for worse. And we wanted, and I think we all kind of share the idea that a lot of what drives artists is to engage in things that they find uncomfortable. Yeah. So you want to probe. It's like you have an itch, you want to figure out where it's going, how it's being done. So the technology of choice that United myself chose was the very same technology that was done to create the ear on the back of the mouse, which is called tissue engineering. And that's technology that was basically very crafty. It's about sculpting living tissue using almost like a lost wax, like a jewelry system of lost wax, where you basically start with a degradable polymer that you shape in whatever organ you're trying to replace, and then you seed it with the tissue and the cells of that organ, and supposedly you have a new organ. It's not working like that. Biology is way more complicated, but it gives a new palette for artistic sculpture with living biological tissues. So we started that, we knocked on the door of the scientists at UWA, and rather than kicking us out, she invited us in. And we learned the techniques ourselves. And this is another thing. It's like a lot of what's happening in science and technology is actually not rocket science. Artists are way more adapted to engage and have the craft to be able to do those things because of our training. So we spent time in UWA, and we spent a year in Harvard Medical School with the very same scientists that did the mouse on the back, because you want to go to the source, you want to understand. And there we found ourselves doing things like growing meat in the lab as a statement in regard to what kind of relationship we're going to have with, you can't get more intimate with another living being than incorporating it and making it part of your body by eating it. So that was our interest. And then a decade later, a scientist did it, adopting our kind of performative techniques as well as a performance in London. So we've done that. We grew wings out of pig tissue, and by that created the first pig wings, because some of the promises of those new technologies make us wonder if things could fly one day. Yeah, so we wanted to see what shape those wings would take. So, but Symbiotica itself, I must say, was much broader than just working with living tissue, because our interest was what's happening to life from the molecular level to the ecological level. And the idea was to place artists, to work with scientists, not, and that was something that was extremely important for us. I think it's extremely important when we think about kind of the role of the arts. Always treat the artists as equals. So when we started, we were guests and we had to ask favors. We managed to set up Symbiotica as a place where the artists are equal to all of the other researchers around them, where they can ask a question, they can probe, and they can do the research without feeling that they're uninvited guests.
Does that sort of value play out in those environments?
Sorry?
Does that sort of value of the arts play out in those environments?
So the value is really opening it up. You know, I tend not to celebrate what I refer to as the secondary outcomes. I think the interesting thing is the type of articulation and development of at least pointing out the fingers at the things that we need more cultural scrutiny of. Because we shouldn't leave those decisions just in the hands of scientists and engineers and government and business people. We really need to open this debate. And I think artists, again, are really well poised in doing so. But the secondary outcome is opening up the minds of the scientists to realize that their research can go to places that they never imagined. To realize that there's ways in which solving the problems that they are facing there's other ways to do it. Artists are always kind of improvisers, and they try to find ways to solve problems without a solutionist approach, because the problems we're trying to solve are about how we create more awareness, how we identify things that we need to investigate further, in a sense, from a cultural perspective.
Yeah. I really like the idea of sort of methodology, but also the perspectives that artists, they're not necessarily unique to artists, but that artists bring to those environments, transform those environments, and in turn are also transformed as well. The following segue, so from pigwings and tissue art to writing, literature, I'd like to turn to Kate. So Kate, you're editor of Westerly, and so I sort of wanted to think about what value the benefits of literary storytelling bring to the writers and communities that you work with. And speaking from this perspective of a small art organisation, what levers are needed from government to help support small art organisations like this?
Okay, big question. For those of you who don't know, Westerly is a literary magazine. We publish creative writing, fiction, short stories, creative non-fiction, and it's covering scholarly research and literary studies alongside, so looking to engage in those complex conversations about what literature is and does. We publish writing from all across Australia and internationally. We're open to submissions worldwide. We've got readers in 17 countries. So we've got the first goal in inviting that reading and that conversation. And to me, what the biggest benefit, most immediate impact Westerly has is really in representation. We need diverse stories. Diverse stories help empower writers to be heard. They help readers to see themselves reflected. Back to the point about half the mirror, to feel seen realistically. And that idea of we need diverse stories comes a little bit from Recognition, and we need diverse books because and as in Queensland, writer from WA answers really beautifully. I think I'll put it on there, and that's a really important point. We need diverse books because a lack of diversity is a failure of our humanity. Literature without diversity presents a false image of what it is to be human. It masks and therefore contributes to the continuation of existing inequities, and it widens the gulf of understanding that are already swallowing compassion for each other. For us, Westerly, I think that's a really sort of deep mission statement for us, in the sense of suggesting what it is to be human and exploring that through representation of diverse stories. Not just diversity of perspectives, but of voices, of emotions, of experiences, of diversity of forms, recognising that literature is really a space of sophistication, thought, of complex thinking and deep thinking. It's a space that needs to be safe. There's an onus on us to protect sort of the general society inclusivity, equal representation, but there's also an empowerment possible in that space as a safe site for social thinking as well, for ideas to come into contact with the world, to form, to form. and for multiple voices to be heard in multiple forms of performance. So that's really what I see is the value and the benefit that Westerly offers. In terms of challenges, to me the big challenge in this is really precarity. Small organisations face the inability for a small organisation to work with a long-term strategy because of that precarity. And I want to just, the reason I'm working on notes is that I think there's some important points to make in this. I want to break that down. That precarity is recognising from our perspective, from Westerly's perspective, that we're hugely privileged in our funding. We have been wonderfully supported, and not just by the University of Western Australia, who host us, but also by the department at a state level, DLGC, by Australia Council of the Arts and Fund, federal level, by the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund, and other funds like that. We've really enjoyed a wonderful range of supporting bodies, recognising what we're doing and backing that. But that at least demonstrates the sort of burden that comes from seeking that funding. That's multiple and concurrent applications on a regular basis. We're submitting at a minimum 4 and usually around 6 applications a year. That's approximately 110 hours of labour minimum, and we're a team of less than 1 full-time person. So we currently combine 0.7 FTE in our team. That's editorial, admin staff, the whole kit and caboodle. Alongside that, we have some external staff and sort of a body of advisors who do contribute, but that's volunteer labour on top of what is encompassed within that. Okay. So this burden of seeking funding consumes time which might be otherwise directed to our core purpose, time which is very valuable. It's still funding for a small staff group. It also creates a huge level of fatigue and stress. In the sense that there's a really low level of success in this process. Those applications are highly competitive, and it's really disillusioning when you're putting in a strong application and it's not back multiple times. It's also recognising that it's difficult to stand out constantly in articulating that value and writing applications again and again across the year. There's this pressure to feel like your applications constantly need something new, shiny thing. So when you're submitting an application, looking for support and advocating for this big new shiny thing, you don't have the pressure of maintaining that acceleration in your formation and production, constantly expanding in ways which really isn't sustainable when you come back to considering the core purpose and the work that it takes to keep this up. And I'm recognising, having said that at the start, that we're very privileged in this front. So if we're feeling like that, if we're feeling that pressure, really hate to think what it's like for other organisations who have not been so well supported. And what it's like, particularly for individual artists who are facing that same slog and their income, their ability to fit themselves is reliant on that treadmill process of constantly trying to attract project funding year in year out. Coming out of that with ambitions, that's all then have a load of managing and quitting those grants. So on top of those 6 applications every year, for every successful application, you have an equivalent performance application to deliver as the outcome said. So the workload for a small arts organisation is huge. I'm sure you guys can speak to that as well. And the precarity that comes with that workload is enormous because each of these applications are for usually over 12 months at most. So the ability to plan long term and work long term and jumping from application to application is absurd and really, really difficult. So what I'm really interested in this cultural policy review, and I think it's incredibly important, is seeing some conversation between sort of the state and federal level around a cohesive funding structure, not necessarily a combined program of funding, but some recognition of how those sort of facets and elements of funding work in cohesion and work together, and the ways in which that can facilitate and reduce precarity for small organisations. And recognising too that I'd really like to see a funding body supporting based business, not requiring that new shiny thing, but recognising, I suppose, the sort of non-sexy realities of what it takes to produce art. funding-based staffing, funding admin, those sorts of base organisational function that's really necessary for our ability to be able to create that high value, but does not so well on education. It's really hard to make admin look sexy. So,
That's a great podcast title. Unsexy realities.
I think those are things that I see needing to change those believers, but
Thanks very much, Kate, for everyone. Apparently, yeah, definitely, I'm sure that a lot of people can relate to working in regards. So, I mean, you talked about what state and federal government can do. We don't have the federal government representing one. I'm not just really special. Usually, because there's now currently government, point being taken that owners can't call justice. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work you as a department have been doing to support art organisations and these more meaningful organisations?
Yeah. And I just want to just acknowledge what you said, because it is the holy grail. If we could align not only federal, state, but also local government. And there are some terrifying stories, especially in Aboriginal controlled organisations, about the number of different parts of government they engage with to, get all the funding together to do what they do. It is one of the key challenges, I think, for all of us. So in terms of talking about what the government is doing at the moment, obviously we're coming out of a difficult period, but some of the key priorities that came the government went into still stand and are now coming back onto the table. And in terms of where we are with the arts and cultural policy, I guess one of the big ticket items that sits above everything is this question about diversifying the WA economy over the next decade. It's not a new conundrum, as former Premier here will be very familiar with, but the question of the boom bust cycle around dependency on the resource sector. It's a difficult difficult conversation to have at a time of boom, when resources in terms of labour and everything are being sucked into what is clearly a very hungry sector at the moment. But I guess the recognition that the 2% is tiny, and that Curtin research was very interesting, because yes, it's 2%, but it's a very important 2%, and it's a catalyst into a lot of other parts of the economy that it may not directly be measured as creative and cultural industries, but it does kind of leapfrog those skills into other areas. So that's an area of key interest, and within that are a bundle of cultural industries that have been identified as potential for development. First one of the rank is screen and the film sector. It's been recognised that we are behind in terms of the rest of Australia, in terms of what we have in infrastructure here, but also the mechanisms we have to attract film to the state. And there's been a lot of free money flying around the globe over recent years, and now it's looking for a home. A lot of it is going into investment in film. There's obviously a lot of platforms and the content. So the state is still in discussion about the development of the studio, but it has already launched an incentive program that will hopefully bring external investment in film to the state, as well as stimulate the local production companies. And I don't know if you saw that last night, the first Disney Plus commission of the Shipwreck Hunters premiere, which was a really big thing for us. Documentary and factual being one of the strongest areas of film production in the state. So that's been a big learning curve for me, I have to say, coming from the background I have and then moving into government. The other thing is the investment in childhood and young people. So there's a commitment towards creative learning to try and investigate a kind of longer term proposition on how we might bring back access to creative learning opportunities in schools. Not only to expose kids to arts and cultural experiences, but also to develop tools in terms of creative thinking that they can carry as lifelong skills, whether they choose to go into a creative pathway in their own careers, or just apply those in their lives in terms of resilience, mental health, and other professional outcomes that may come through. The regions is also still a very strong area of focus, and that is supported by the regional royalties for regions money, which is an incredible asset that we have to invest in the regional communities. And I think that is becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of acknowledging that regional communities need to, it's a quality of life issue that needs to be accessible across the state as much as possible. Also, the interrelationship with tourism and the growth of cultural events across the state. Diversity and inclusion has been a key policy area for some time now, and I think we're seeing great results there, both in the development of audiences and people on stage, and lots to celebrate in Black Swan and Perth Festival's production. Julia Hales, who's just had standing ovations all the way through the UK and Sydney with that incredible production. And then, of course, what you've alluded to, the sustainability of the sector into the longer term, how it can be addressed. But one of the things I would also say that COVID has kind of illuminated for us is that the state is heavily engaged with the sector through funding. So the funding part of the sector was also very kind of close and visible. But what we didn't really understand or have such a a grip on was the commercial sector, who were impacted sometimes far worse than any by COVID. And what that's brought up then is what are the conditions we need to put in place for the security of that commercial sector who don't receive funding but still need an operating environment that will support them to thrive. One of the interesting things there about the Curtin research again is that we're a net importer of cultural product. But pre-COVID, 2018, we had the highest per capita spend on performing arts in the whole country. So we clearly are very engaged. And so one of the things that interests me is we need to focus on our own artists and creators that we produce here, but we can also facilitate through our investment in infrastructure and good things, bringing stuff into the state and making this a good destination for external stuff. Because the reality is we are still small. We're never going to be able to compete with some of the bigger players, but we can reach out and make connections nationally and globally still through our institutions if we're equipped to do that well.
Thanks very much for the comprehensive answer, Sheila. I think it's good to be aware of what's priorities for state government in that space. So I want to draw attention to something that Jeremy, you mentioned before the conversation, which is to say to temper our expectations too. This is that national cultural policy will bring in terms of what government can achieve as well. Government can only be playing a certain role within that. There are other key players that must step up as well to a degree. And that leads me to my final question before I go out to the audience, which is something that's been here on the edges of our conversation a little bit. Is sort of reliance on the resources sector. And that's not unique to arts, something that's maybe cross-border more generally, but reliance on the resources sector that boosts arts money is perhaps going to be a problem for the arts community, but in terms of diversity of funding. So how much funding is too much? And what might we do to either lessen this reliance on the resources sector? And is there a risk of self-censorship? No, 3 questions in one there.
It's complicated. And it's something inherently Western Australian in the sense of the way that our sector and ecology and financial model has grown. And it is a problem, as I said, there's been a rise of activism. And I think people are now considering the impact of their decisions and what is it to be ethical around giving, around partnering, and around accepting money from services, be that individual organisations and a lot of things. A lot of what BBI Collective. Through that role, we've developed a really comprehensive ethical partnering framework, which is available, which they've generously offered to the sector and is on their website for particularly independent artists to use. But then I respect personally on the level those organisations and the individuals that choose to still, accept funding and use that to sort of create and make their work as well. So I think I need to sort of, I'm a former employee of Rio Tinto and I do a lot of work in the community investment team there. So that's part of the background that I bring to this sort of conversation too. And look, had I not spent that 5 years in that organisation, in a very different area to where it is now, I would not be the person that I am now, knowing the things I do and knowing how to work with the not-for-profit sector. So I do know that there are good people in those organisations that are doing really good stuff, and they are, giving it a red hot go to make things better for the partners that they work with in the not-for-profit sector. Yes, the money's not great. Yes, they don't do really good things in terms of environmental impact, First Nations communities and other parts of our society. But that's, I think we're a long way from being able to cut the cord completely.
Maybe I should plug also on 25th of October, the Chamber of Art and Culture actually has a full day session around ethical investment in the arts. So you should, if you're interested in those questions, that we explore further. My interest in this is a policy we made at Symbiotica that we would refuse funding from pressure groups. So anyone that is trying to influence the way we do things, that try to harm our integrity and autonomy, even the perceived one, would be an issue for us to receive funding. So we refuse funding from the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, as well as from biotech companies. Yeah, so it's not one side of the game or the other. It's how you maintain your integrity and your autonomy as an artist to be able to do things. And it is very perceptual as well. It's like, what's the optics of getting that? So I think we need to find a mechanism where art can still benefit from those people who have too much money and they want to, park it somewhere. But it's have to be in such a way that the artists would maintain the autonomy.
Just to pick up on what you're saying now, Oron, I think it's a complicated question in the Western Australian context in particular, because we are a small, close-knit sector with complex relationships between organisations and institutions. I could say that Westerly is not taking funding from the resources sector, but we see it within UWA. UWA is taking funding from the resources sector. So the complicity and the levels of complicity in those questions is difficult to navigate and very complicated. That said, I think, and this might be part of the distinction that you're drawing, Oron, there needs to be some recognition of recognising that, working through that, considering that, taking that on board, and trying to build a future for the sector that is sustainable, bearing that question in mind, and participating in arts washing, which is, both something quite profound and really ironic when we're talking about arts and culture sector, when what is often being washed and cleansed is the destruction of culture in other ways. So there's a really deep paradox in that question for the arts sector, particularly in WA's community. Particularly, I don't think this one will be answers panel necessarily, except to say that it's something we will have to bear in mind.
Sorry,
Just a small observation, which is this question of the social dividend, and how that is built into a lot of business models, particularly international businesses. It's interesting, but the idea of social dividend sometimes isn't explicit in local businesses, and so it's interesting just to see how different business models work.
Yes, very much. I think, as Kate said, it's important to recognise those complex relationships. Maybe the point about throwing a lot better brass as well. But I might leave it there because I want to leave enough time to hear from you, the audience. Just a point of clarification as well. Or in the event that you mentioned on the 25th of October, is in fact a whole day's symposium on ethical arts funding, hosted by the Chamber of Arts and Culture WA. So if anyone's interested, check the word at the end. I'd like to hand it over to you.
I'm just talking there.
So I can just also just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Then we want to get through as many questions as possible. So we briefly stated it, then direct it to a member of our audience or the audience.
Hello, thank you for the conversation. I've been reporting on the arts in Western Australia for 30 years, and I find this conversation rather disappointing. I mean, I receive emails still from organisations, including the one that you led, Shelagh, and just earlier this year they talked about the fact that in the survey they ran, it highlighted that 63% of participants had immediate issues with their operating costs, totaling 30 million. The survey also recorded that 50%, half of small to medium arts bodies will be operating on reserves, or in some cases will cease operations within the next 12 months. These are real figures from the chamber itself. When I first came to WA, I would argue there was more coverage of the arts than there is now. Art practice is not seen, it's not heard, it's not analysed, it's not critiqued in the way it was even when I came here. The media outlets have diminished, and I commend Cecil, for example, as a small but really valiant attempt to cover the issues. After 30 years, we are at a point where corporate giants in mining and resources are the major sources of funding. And I take your point, Kate, about people having to put in funding applications. I would argue that 4 to 6 a year is infinitesimal compared with the kind of funding applications people are having to make. And very often it's to corporate giants. So to your point, Oron, about cultural scrutiny, we'll try that when your sponsor comes from a certain sector that perhaps doesn't want to have an analysis of some of the issues. Community building, it requires artists who can actually make a living and also have a venue. Spare Parts Puppet Theatre has just lost that venue. Yet 1 decade ago, it went to one of the most respected architectural firms. In fact, I think it was the one that designed our state theatre company and came up with a plan for a building. A decade on, nothing's happened. We have no Indigenous cultural centre yet, and yet, for all the 30 years that I've been here, there has been a growing network of Indigenous art centres that is unrivaled by the rest of the nation, but we have not capitalised or taken account of that sufficiently. At Warburton, the biggest community-owned collection in the nation exists there. They have toured to China almost exclusively off their own bat. One of the biggest tours to China that's ever been held of Indigenous art. So my plea, I think, is for all that this is a difficult period, I take your point in some ways, Sheila, we have a massive surplus in this state, and diversifying the economy, I agree, is essential. But could we please look at government and the commitment of this government in encouraging this community of West Australians to look at our art sector and fund it properly and encourage it properly, and to not just have us waiting for a generation for a new museum, which we did, and wait still for decent and major investment in a decent art gallery, which we still haven't had. So my plea is for all the artists out there. I feel for them, and I think it deserves a lot more funding.
I will just say one thing, which I did leave off my list, the Aboriginal Cultural Centre is in training. I don't know if we're doing it before that one.
And if I may, Vicky, thank you so much for raising those things. The first point that I had here was the visibility of the arts in the media, which we don't have. Can you help us with that? So how can we do it? Because it's obvious, I know with my own experience, I got international TV crews shooting my shows here in Perth. It wasn't even a mention. The only mention I got in West Australia was the caricature on the page 2 of me growing Kevin Rudd on the back of a mouse. The level of media engagement, again, besides some stories that you made.
You ask your Department of Culture and the Arts to put a subsidy in for coverage of arts events, like it. You've got a bicentennial coming up in which the government is planning to spend money on arts activities, but you need money now.
So for the second, we have a question up there, please.
Thank you so much for the discussion this evening. I wanted to talk about influencing wider government policy to support work-life balance that can then facilitate more people having the time and the money to engage with either by volunteering or attending art and cultural events and programs. A lot of people feel so run off their feet that they can't engage with this sector. So can we influence policies so people have the time to engage with the sector?
I can pick that one up and thank you for that question. And I think to thank you, Vicky, for your points as well, because part of what is being called for there and that investment is part of the answer to that question. It's there's sort of a twofold relationship going on there between work-life balance for arts workers, recognising that that shortfall in precarity, that shortfall in labour is met by volunteer work. Pretty much all the time. And the burden of that volunteer work kind of being passed on to the participants on quite a regular basis is partly what is inhibiting the balance and the ability to engage in much more important flexible ways. And I think part of the reason when I'm speaking publicly about these questions of what we want in policy, that I don't want to simply shout and scream for more money, which is absolutely what I want inside, is this sense of a little bit of preaching to the choir. That the conversations I'm having in the audiences I'm having them with are very much as people who feel that already too. And that these questions of looking for greater investment and wanting greater investment to meet all of these concerns, meet that greater value, meet greater reach, the sustainability of the sector, the increase of the sector's visibility, the expansion of the sector comes back to things that everybody very generally recognises that there needs to be a greater investment across all art forms. And I think I've probably got off track a little bit for your question there, but that idea of work-life balance really does fall into that sense of it being an underfunded sector. And that luxury of funding being part of what makes a sector sustainable, and sustainability in turn leading to those luxuries of balance between influence and engagement.
We have a question from our audience online. Sheila, you mentioned 5 expected outcomes of the arts, like creativity, disability, etc. What can researchers and stakeholders do so that these outcomes are valued and embedded systematically in schooling, where dominant discourses prioritize neoliberal ideas like competition, individualized learning, and so forth? So how do we prioritize, how do we try and shift things and prioritize creativity in schooling, not just competition?
I guess by demonstrating the big body of research that is available about the benefits of childhood access to arts and culture experience, particularly kids before 8, although a lot of that research also shows that it's more impactful if it's done in a home and social environment. So that's quite interesting, the balance between what's education in school and what's education in the home and your broader life. But I guess by better demonstrating in our own terms, in our own context, what those benefits would be to having a better education system.
I wanted to go back to your second question, Chris, and to Sheila's comment that arts and culture kind of we tend to roll them together, whereas there is some difference. So I certainly believe in the value of the arts in terms of promoting social cohesion and giving voice to different peoples and in promoting tourism or educating kids. But what I find missing in tonight's discussion most of the time, and most of the time in discussion about the arts generally in our zeitgeist, is a sense of the arts as valuable in and of themselves. These social values of the arts are what come into play in the short term, and governments, of course, relate to the short terms. But we don't value Shakespeare enough for what he said about Jews or Denmark. We value him really for what he did with language and staging and his psychological insights. It's what he did for theatre and for writing in itself. And art, for art's sake, can sound rather precious and rarefied, but in the end, in the long run, it seems to me that's where the value of the arts lies. And so much of the discussion about arts in our current period tends to turn it into social work.
Yeah.
I think the question there is around arts for art's sake. That's something that you talked about, Oron. Would you like to jump on that?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about, and I actually spoke to Martin Kemp, who's the big Leonardo scholar from Oxford, and he mentioned this idea that art is a function but not a utility, and a function but not a utility. The minute, and that's why I said that I'm reluctant to talk about the secondary outcomes of artists working with new sets of knowledge as well, because it's really about the function of art. By being useless, you distill the issues and the essence of what you are trying to deal with. The minute you start to think about those secondary outcomes with utilitarian outputs, and that's why I have the issue also with kind of monetizing it, you start to lose what the essence of art is. And how we can come to terms, how we can convince politicians and bureaucrats that this is, because there's no matrix to measure it. And the impact can be, you talked about Shakespeare, it can take 300 years to realize the impact. How do you actually allow that to happen and give the space for artists to engage in those useless acts because they actually have a very important function in our society? This is, I suppose, the question we all need to ask.
Can I just respond to that as well? I absolutely take your point, Dennis, and I think that's an important conversation to have when we're thinking about arts policy in terms of what the policy allows for and what it denies. But I also want to recognise that art's sake is an incredible position of privilege, and that, as you were saying, Sheila, not everybody has access to that privilege, and that part of the work of policy is to create equal opportunity and access, thinking about our communities and our nation as a whole. And so I think part of the tendency to talk about value and social impact when we're having discussions of policy is about ways of leveraging what we understand as the value of art's sake to ensure that policy can encompass that sort of broad spectrum.
Whenever it comes to funding, one should always look at the books. And I think governments, what they value is looked at by the budget, and if you look at the millions and billions that go in hospital subsidies compared to the arts, then we really have that conversation. That's a separate one. But what I'm really interested in was what Jeremy said about fellowships. Now, the number of artists I see who are dropping the practice, who are walking away from arts practice because there comes a certain point in their career where they're no longer supported, they no longer fit into strategies or engagement with youth, whatever. They move either into administration or they just go and get another job completely. So it's supporting people within the middle of their career, moving onwards and sustaining that practice. I think that is so essential. And that sustains arts function.
Absolutely. I think I lost a lot of friends when I was working with councils like boards for the number of fellowships to be increased by the end of the day. And we increased, I think, from which but still, I am a beneficiary of the fellowship. I received, last way, a $10,000 young people in the arts fellowship, professional fellowship, which in those days was like millions. Allowed me to go and spend time working in Canada to sort of learn how to be a producer. And because I was sort of at that stage, had graduated from WAPA, I was doing lighting and production management, and realised there was a stable pathway in that sort of career locally at that stage where the sector was at. So I got that fellowship and went over to which was extraordinary. And so I think that for me has then sort of set my path. And I think this week we've just seen the announcement of the Sydney Maya Creative Fellows, which are 8, I think, unrestricted grants of $140,000 across 2 years to artists. And I think that's the one thing. I mean, Oron received in my final year at Noske the Emerging Experimental Arts Fellowship, so that's still going for all accounts.
Yeah, and I think, so there's some other countries that have different models where artists, once they declare they're an artist, they get like, instead of the dole, they would get the artists that would allow them to continue, which is a great idea. But going back to Jeremy's point, the very first grant that I received was tiny. I think it was like $3,000 from PICA from R&D. But just the trust that was given to me as a young artist just coming out of university to allow me to start my project, and they believed, they were more than willing to fail. The question was, can we use living tissue as a medium for artistic expression? 20 odd years ago, the answer would be like a resounding no, but they gave us the money. So this those small gestures of trust, it's not just about the money, it's about the recognition. And then I think we have also the older artists, that, as you said, that they are falling off of those kind of initiatives, and we need to somehow find a way to support them. Very similar, I suppose, to, that's why so many artists decide to go and do PhDs. And as a way of, they have a 3-year kind of fellowship. But there's another story. That we won't have time to unpack it now. Yeah.
Thanks very much for all the questions. That's all we have time for. One thing before we do, sort of one last question. Quick 30-second take on each of you. We talked a lot about what are the issues that we address, the challenges and the opportunities. What's a good story to tell? What's the one thing that gives you hope about art and culture in Australia? And I think it's, for me, it's important to end this conversation.
I can start if you like. For me, what gives me hope in my work with Westerly in particular is just the enthusiasm and passion of the artists, the writers we engage with, the willingness of my wonderful super team of people to contribute those volunteer hours, the phenomenal growth in submissions. We receive up to 900, maybe 1,000 submissions for each issue, which create a workload, but is also really exciting to see. That's a really dynamic, creative state, and this is in context of a sector that is undersupported and underfunded. So the hope is in what could happen, what explosion, what flourishing could happen with more funding.
Sure.
I guess I'm optimistic that we're at such a tipping point in terms of the cultural values and how they are being expressed within our institutions, but also within our society. And I'm ruminating still more on Dennis's question because, at the heart of it all, the journey that we're on together and separately in this place that we're calling can only be expressed in terms of myth and poetry because it doesn't make sense any other way. And to create a space for us to create that mythology of our own and to express ourselves to each other in the language of empathy and hope, it's the only way to get past a lot of damage and hurt and healing, but to keep that optimism going that, we're just flawed human beings on a big, long journey that's beyond our comprehension, really, traveling around in space until we get exploded by the sun, as my but yeah, you have to let the space for that kind of craziness in your thinking, otherwise you just lynch yourself.
Absolutely.
Or, I suppose, being here for more than 30 years and seeing how finally Australia as a cultural society recognized wrongdoing we've done in the past. And the hope is that the same mindset would help us to have foresight, not to continue going wrong. And I think culture has a huge role to play.
Yeah, sort of goes back to the opening statement about being the change we want to see. I think finally we're seeing new people telling stories, new people being part of those stories, new people on stages and screening, in leadership positions, organisations and whatnot. And I think it's good because it's generating a lot more conversation, awareness, and hopefully space.
Thanks very much. Well, now, can you please give a round of applause? Before we wrap up, I just wanted to say a quick round of thanks as well, and for all people made tonight possible. So firstly, we've got a chance to who is a champion and supporter of the social issues and the source for this. Our consultation officer for pretty much making it possible tonight. Really absolutely about this conversation. Our wonderful researchers, John Carroll, which is now. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Our conversation can't happen with your support. So thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Oh, really?